My topic today is being objective about objectivism. It's a title and a topic that I was asked to cover by the Institute, and it's part of a series of talks I've done over the last few years on thinking objectively, different aspects of being objective in your thought. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about my motivation for being interested in this topic, both generally being objective, speaking about it, and then today being objective about objectivism. There were really two motives that I had in mind when I started talking on these topics a few years ago. The first is that I've always been really interested in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge, but I found that many presentations of epistemology, objectivist and otherwise, were undermotivated, or they were motivated in a strange way. You get a lot at the front about how important knowledge is, how important it is to life, how much we need it, how much we need to get things right. But too often we don't hear enough as we go through each point about what difference each point in the field makes to our life and thinking. And it felt to me, even in some of my own courses on epistemology, which I generally like, and as I listen to others, a little bit like what they call geeking out over esoteric details or ideas, rather than like a philosophy for living on Earth. But I think these ideas do make a difference for living on Earth. And I particularly personally enjoy seeing and showing how even the most technical and seemingly esoteric material in philosophy makes a difference between good and evil, joy and misery, life and death. That's a perspective I learned from Atlas Shrugged, and it's something I've wanted to convey in these talks. My second motive relates to something else that I got from Atlas Shrugged. I really admire the heroes of Atlas, Galt in particular, and in particular I admire the way in which he cares what's true. Dagny, witnessing Galt at a difficult moment in his life, notices that ruthless tone, peculiarly his, which sounded implacable by being simple, devoid of any emotional value, save the quality of respect for facts. That character, that's a standard I want to live up to. And the novel makes clear, or anyway, the novel illustrates, that not many people do live up to it. It's rare, it's peculiarly Galt's, and more importantly, that not many people even want to. And sadly, as I look around at the world, that's the conclusion I draw too. Not many people want this. Look at our political climate. What's driving the people who are taking place in most political debates most of the time, both the candidates on stage and people just talking about politics? It seems like they want to belong to some tribe or other. Liberals, conservatives, libertarians, progressives, the social justice warriors who rightly get accused of political correctness, and the Trumpites and others who go on accusing them of it. These are people who want to see themselves as part of something, some group, some tribe, to score points against the other competing tribes, and to express outrage to signal their virtue to their fellow tribesmen. But you don't see much of an interest in what's true. And we see this problem, this kind of motivation, this trumping of the truth, this trumping of even concern for the truth, everywhere in life, everywhere in our culture. And I think we see plenty of it, unfortunately, in our objectivist movement too, because it's just everywhere. I notice myself lapsing into it sometimes. But it's not why I'm here, that motive. It's not what I want out of this conference. It's not what I want out of this community. And it's not what I want out of my life. And for a lot of you, I hope most of you, it's not why you're here. Even if we don't always live up to Galt's standard, or if we haven't always lived up to it in the past, I think that it's an ideal that we, a lot of us anyway, share and aspire to. I think that's part of what brought us here. Being objective is respecting the facts. It's respecting them deliberately and self-consciously. And by talking about what's involved in doing that, I want to help and to inspire each of us to live up to Galt's standard. In so doing, we shape ourselves and our community and our world in the image of our highest values. So how am I going to do this? What's my agenda for today? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about what objectivity is in general and what it requires, This will be review of some of the previous talks I've given, but not everyone's been at them. You can get some of them on YouTube, though. I'm going to talk a little bit about what objectivism is, as I understand it. And then I'm going to make a few points about how the general points I've made about being objective apply specifically to thinking about objectivism in light of what it is. And then I'm going to conclude with a few suggestions about how what I've said relates to building a healthier movement or community, since that's the theme of this conference. Okay, so let's begin. Being objective about objectivism. Let's start with being objective. I said being objective is having respect for facts. Let me come at it in a little bit of a different way, though. You can think of it as taking responsibility for your own ideas. And for the sake of this talk, I'm going to use ideas as a catch-all term to include concepts, conclusions, and values. Taking responsibility for your concepts, conclusions, and values. What does that mean? Well, it means recognizing that these things are products of your own mind. In any case, they're products of the human mind, even if you didn't come up with a certain concept, say objectivism, or libertarianism, or conservatism, or extremism, or isolationism, or minarchism. Some of those, I think, are invalid concepts. But even if you didn't come up with it yourself, you've at some point adopted it, embraced it, made it yours, and you didn't have to. There are alternative ways of thinking about these things. You have to own the fact that this is something you're doing, thinking of the world in these ways, and you could be thinking of it in other ways. Likewise, for convictions or conclusions that you hold. Other people hold other ones. You could have come to another conclusion. That you believe this, say that selfishness is a good, is something that you're responsible for. And say the same goes with your values, the goals that direct the course of your life. Different people have different ones. You could have had different ones. You could change the ones you have now. These are things that you're responsible for. They're products of your own mind, of your own thinking or failure to think. And to succeed in life, you need these ideas. You need your concepts, your conclusions, and your values to be in touch with reality. That's why we have to care what the facts are. But they're not necessarily in touch with reality. Rand pointed out on a number of occasions that human beings are neither infallible nor omniscient. And what that means is that our ideas can be mistaken because we're not infallible, and they can be inadequate to our lives because we're not omniscient. Even if a certain idea is true, so far as it goes, it might not be enough to guide you to a successful, happy life. Because we're neither infallible or omniscient, ideas can be mistaken or inadequate. And because of this, we need to learn how to form concepts, conclusions, and values in a reality-oriented way. And we need to apply this knowledge deliberately in our own lives and thinking. That deliberate application of knowledge of how to form concepts, conclusions, and values is objectivity. That's what it is to take responsibility for your own ideas. It's because Galt lives like that, and lives like that consistently, and has built it into his soul to live like that, that he has that intransient respect for facts that's so distinctive to him, distinctive in degree, but attainable by all of us. The alternative to living this way is being subjective. And that means letting your thoughts and your life be determined not by yourself and not based on reality, but by accidental features of your circumstances and moods. That's what we see all around us. That's what people are like by default. And it takes knowledge and deliberate effort to be objective, to own your ideas, to own your life, to be Galt-like. You have to take responsibility for the process of knowing and valuing. So what is that process? How do we know and how do we value? That's a little bit too big a topic to cover here. That's all of philosophy. You can get the very rudiments of how to know from Harry Binswanger's course in the morning and from his book, on which it's based. But let me just say a few things by way of broad sketch to give us some orientation to what's involved so we can think about what it means to take responsibility for the process. We're aware of the world effortlessly and automatically in sense perception. When you look out at the world, there are certain things you just know, certain facts that you're just in touch with. On the basis of this rudimentary knowledge, we can form rudimentary concepts uniting perceptibly similar objects, and we can make rudimentary judgments about these objects. We could also set rudimentary, immediate, simple, short-range goals, like, I want that milk. I'm thinking of something an infant might do, right? Over time, we can leverage this knowledge to form further concepts and reach further conclusions that cohere into an increasingly complex understanding of our world and of our place in it. And on the basis of this understanding, we're able to form a conception of what we want out of our lives. In doing that, we're able to advance from acting on immediate, perceptible, short-range goals to living by long-range conceptual values. And the culmination of that is having an ethics and having a plan for your own life that's understood in ethical terms. Now, the essence of this whole process of starting with perception, of integrating your perception into concepts and judgments, of forming longer and longer range values, is something that we learn and that we perform unself-consciously in early childhood. And that gets us a certain way. But to sustain the process at the level needed to direct a human life, what we can do unself-consciously as a child is not enough. People need to grow up. And what growing up involves, what taking responsibility for your mind and your life involves, is articulating that process and committing to it and performing it self-consciously. And that, again, is what being objective is about. How can you tell? Where's the dividing line between what you can do unself-consciously and automatically and what you need to take responsibility for and do effortfully? Well, how do you know when you need more thought, when you need to work on something? Well, Ayn Rand has a very nice formulation that I think is psychologically evocative here that she discusses in the context of concepts. How do you know when you don't have a concept right, when you need to take responsibility for it and work at it more? And it's the first time you find yourself using words with the sense, I kind of know what I mean. Are you an objectivist? Well, I kind of know what I mean by that. I'm not sure. Are you whatever the case may be, right? The first time you find yourself using words with that sense, you have to think, well, how do I know what I mean in the cases where I really do know what I mean? And how can I bring that clarity to this case? Likewise, we can think about cases in which I kind of know why I believe what I do. It may be not a total mystery to me, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Or I kind of know what I want out of life, or why I'm living in the way that I am. Whenever we experience this as we probe ourselves, we know that it's time to do some more work, to take responsibility for the concepts, the conclusions, the values involved, to recognize them as products of our own mind that need improvement, need clarifying. And how do we do it? How do we do that improving, clarifying, making more explicit, and checking? Well, again, it's a big topic, the topic of all of epistemology on the one hand and all of ethics on the other. But I want to just name two key elements of it. And these, they're in Ayn Rand, but I learned them from Leonard Peikoff. The first is reduction. Reduction is tracing an idea step by step back to its basis in perception. You think, where did I get this? Where did this come from? And you go one step back, and you think, well, yeah, but how do I know that? Where did that come from? How can I be sure? And you go back and back until you're at perception, or at least at the level of something where you no longer only kind of know what you mean by it and why you think it. You understand it fully and firmly. That's reduction. And the second related element is integration. Integration is relating each idea with other ideas to form a wider whole. And this is a process that you iterate so it becomes a wider and wider whole. Integration has two important functions here. The less important of the two, though still very important, is that it's an error-checking mechanism. When you integrate one idea with another, you might find that they contradict. When you integrate one value with another, you might find that they clash and you can't have both of them, like the value of having your cake and of eating it too. And in these situations where you come up with a contradiction in your integrating, You have to, in Ayn Rand's famous words, Hugh Axton's famous words, check your premises. That is, go back down the steps in the reduction of each of the things that conflict, that contradict, and see where there's a mistake, because there's got to be a mistake somewhere. There's only one reality, and if you come to think that it's both A and not A, or want it to be both A and not A, you've made a mistake somewhere along the line. Go find it. That's one feature of integration, error checking. A second feature of it that I think is even more important is it's really the essence of how we proceed from superficial observations, like what we just get in perception or a little bit beyond that, to a position in which we really understand the world. Integration is about putting things together, moving out to a larger whole. And just as an example of this, how this moving out to a larger whole aids understanding, let me mention a point that I learned from Aristotle, and it's an essential point. The way he puts it is, it would be a mistake to try to explain about fig trees why they lose their leaves in the winter. Why is it a mistake to try to explain it about fig trees? And how would you try to go about doing it? You'd think about all the things you know about fig trees, and you'd just be casting about at random. Well, maybe it's because figs are most enjoyed in the summer, and so they're not needed in the winter, or what? You wouldn't have any way of telling which explanation was the right one. You'd be sort of out to sea. The way you have to do it is you have to think, well, what fig trees aren't unique in losing their leaves in the winter. All trees of a certain sort do. What sort? What do those trees have in common? What's the universal under which, of which all the members of lose their leaves in the winter? Let me move up to the conceptual level here. Oh, it's broad-leafed trees. Okay, well, what, as opposed to, pine trees with the thin, needly leaves. What do those things have in common that enables them or forces them to lose their leaves in the winter? And that's how you think. That's how you discover truths. Think about all the times we do that or need to do that in life. And then thinking about objectivism. There are just tons of questions about objectivism as philosophy, and especially as objectivism as a movement, that come up that I know a lot of people have as they move around in this little social world and notice things happening, that are like, why do fig trees lose their leaves? Why does the objectivist movement have more men than women, or why has it typically had it? Why are there a lot of Jews and gays involved? I mean, it's a good thing I'm half Jewish, but or at least a neutral thing. But historically, the more so than of any other random group of person. Why would that be? Why are there a lot of young people? Why are a lot of those young people, and some of the older ones, obnoxious, kind of aggressive a bit? Why do a lot of them leave, turn hostile, or just get bored? Why is the movement, even among people who don't leave, prone to acrimonious splits? I mean, we're a bit of a fighty lot. What, if anything, can be done about each of these things? None of these questions are really about objectivism as such. They're about wider categories to which it falls. And part of being objective about something is noticing that fact, taking responsibility for framing the right questions at the right level of universality. And that's an issue of integration. Some of these particular questions about objectivism I hope will be answered by later parts of this talk when I do put it under various concepts. But if the answers to any of them aren't clear, you could ask me in the question period and I'll give you my opinion. Some cases I think I know the answers and some not. Okay, so I've been talking about being objective in general, but this talk is now about being objective about objectivism. So what is objectivism? Well, in a phrase, it's the philosophy of Ayn Rand. That's the subtitle of Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, and it's the right subtitle, given that that's what it is. It's a name for Ayn Rand's philosophy. Secondarily, I think, objectivism names a movement or a subculture that's grown up around this philosophy. But let's break down the idea that it's the philosophy of Ayn Rand into some components. First of all, it's philosophy. That is, it deals with the fundamental issues with reference to which a person directs his own life. And there are things that follow about objectivism from its being philosophy, and that follow for the objectivist movement from its being a philosophical movement. First of all, philosophy is abstract and extremely difficult. If you think of the process that starts with noticing that something's a cat and that something's water and deciding you want some milk, the very low levels of the conceptual level, committing yourself to A is A and the principles of rational egoism and deciding whether concepts are formed by measurement omission is at the way other end of that process. It's extremely sophisticated reasoning. And because it's extremely sophisticated, it's difficult and time-consuming. But not only is it extremely difficult and time-consuming, as is true of, say, particle physics, it's also important to everyone for every decision they make in a way that particle physics, as good and important as it is not. And because it's relevant and important to us in how we live our lives, in every decision we make, in how we evaluate ourselves and others, it's something about which emotions run very high, about which it's easy to run off half-cocked, about which there are a lot of temptations to subjectivity, a lot of strong forces that can a lot of mental noise and mixed motivations when everyone's thinking about it. So it's particularly difficult and particularly important and hard to think clearly about. So objectivity is especially necessary in it. Passions run high about it. That's one reason why you should expect philosophical movements to be a bit difficult, a little contentious, and for people to have strong feelings about them. It accesses issues about our self-esteem, about who we are, about what we're doing in life. So far I've been talking about objectivism being philosophy. Let me add now that it's a philosophical system, as distinguished from what? Well, from just some stray points about philosophy. You should always be honest is a philosophical point, particularly if you go a little bit deeper and say honesty is recognizing reality and that the unreal is unreal. But that point just on its own is not a philosophy. It's philosophy, but not a philosophy. Likewise for be selfish, right? But objectivism is a philosophical system as opposed to just one or a collection of several philosophical points. Second, or third, I guess, it's one philosophical system as distinguished from others. Now, this brings me to a little, not quite argument, but disagreement we had on this stage a couple of days ago between Carter Laren and Jason Crawford. They were talking about what do we need this term, this concept objectivism for? And on the one hand, I sympathize with some of the points Carter was making and that I think was driving him. As I'm going to say later in this talk, I think there's a little bit too much focus on, am I an objectivist? Who's an objectivist? Do you believe in objectivism? And really, it's just philosophy, and it's just getting philosophy right, and why don't we just worry about that? What Carter said, I think, evokes a comment by Milton Friedman, was it, who said, there's not Austrian economics and there's just good economics and bad economics, and there's just philosophy and good and bad philosophy. But part of doing philosophy, part of what's involved in philosophy, part of what's involved in taking responsibility for your conclusions and your values on philosophical matters is realizing that questions that we're used to assuming certain answers to and ways of life that we're used to just assuming and taking for granted actually have alternatives to them. That there are more than one way to go here. That the way you're used to, that you've been brought up, might be wrong. There are different alternatives. And then considering what each of the alternatives has going for it, what the reasons are for each. And we do this not just with alternative positions on individual issues, to be honest or dishonest, to sacrifice or be selfish, but also seeing the particular answers to the many different questions falling into different competing and coherent worldviews. And that we have to pick between. And for that reason, I think we need names for the different ones. We need to recognize that there's the objectivist philosophy that adds up to one thing, like there's an Aristotelian and a Humean and a Platonic and a Kantian philosophy. So objectivism is philosophy. It's a philosophy as opposed to just some philosophical point, and it's one philosophy as distinct from others, Kantianism, pragmatism, etc. It's Ayn Rand's philosophy, a philosophy developed by a particular person at a particular time in particular works. This is just now what we mean by objectivism. And that has an implication for the objectivist movement. The objectivist movement, I've already said, is a philosophical movement. Not all movements are. Some movements are about narrower issues. The Bohmian movement in physics, for example. The Montessori movement in education. Some movements in different fields, like those two, that I just gave, which aren't philosophy, and like Marxism in philosophy or Aristotelianism in philosophy, are movements that are based upon the work of a key thinker. Some movements, a bunch of different people have different ideas and they notice there's something in common about them. But other movements are created when people rally to the set of ideas of one person who has some really key insights, like, again, the Montessori method in education, the Montessori movement. And movements like this have certain common qualities. For example, there's a lot of thinking about, well, what is our relation to this founder figure? And some people accuse others of taking that person dogmatically and on faith because they don't disagree with her on things, and they try to prove they're independent by having a list of the 5 points they disagree with. And others think that people are being disrespectful to the person and not taking seriously the mind that is a common value shared by people. All of these features are things that Objectivism shares because it's a movement, Objectivism is a movement based on the work of a key thinker. Finally, Objectivism is a radical philosophy. Not all philosophies are radical. Some philosophers just try to kind of systematize the worldview of their time and push maybe a little bit further in the direction that people are already going. Not so Ayn Rand. She's here to challenge 2,000 years of tradition. She's a radical, a firebrand, someone who's saying, no, the way you guys are living is all wrong. Maybe not all wrong, but very deeply wrong. You've got to change it. You've got to shape up. This is an age of moral crisis. Man's moral code has brought him to the brink. Our society is unjust in deep ways. There are other philosophical movements that do this kind of thing, and other movements in narrower fields than philosophy. Abolitionism was a movement like this, right? Abolitionist thinkers were radicals. Our whole economy is based on slavery, at least in the South. We've got to change that. That's wrong. Your way of living is unjust, you plantation owner, and you guy who buys cotton that was, grown at the plantation. Objectivism is a radical movement. And in radical movements, all the kinds of issues that I talked about, and when thinking about radical philosophies, all the issues that I talked about philosophy in general, that are special challenges to objectivity and make us need it all the more, all of these issues are intensified. You're challenging, you're putting yourself at odds with, you're calling into question seriously and rejecting, or at least considering rejecting, all the things you were brought up to believe, the things that you were brought up to evaluate yourself by. Moreover, you're in a position of being sort of alienated from your society. You're in some sense rejecting the culture and the world you were brought up in. And that places a special value and puts you in a special relationship to other people who are or who seem to be doing the same thing. If one's not careful about that and one doesn't think about it clearly and recognize the role it's playing in one's mind, and when that's good, and when these relationships you're building with other people who have rejected the common wisdom are really based on shared values, it can easily fall into a kind of, this is my tribe and we're together against the rest of the world. Moreover, radical movements have a lot of things in common. They tend to attract people who are bright but alienated, often people from different minority groups, which minority groups have in common that the people in it are well-educated but are sort of outsiders from the society, Jews, homosexuals, people who are immigrants from at least well-educated, immigrants with strong educational tradition. So part of understanding of this movement and part of understanding of this philosophy and your own thinking about this philosophy and how it relates to relating to everyone else here is understanding that we are radicals, or that objectivism is radical. And one last point about the objectivist philosophy that I hesitate to put this way, but I will. It's our philosophy. It's Ayn Rand, she came up with it. Whether she thought it or not is the standard for whether it were part of the standard for whether it's part of objectivism. But it's our philosophy for many of us for the following reasons. Now, this doesn't apply to all of us. Not all of us here think of ourselves as objectivists or should. Indeed, I'm going to argue later that maybe fewer of us should than do, or we shouldn't all face that question immediately. But many of us have been involved in this world for quite a long time, some a lot longer than I have been thinking about these ideas and have been living our lives by our understanding of them for a long time. And so when we think about objectivism, when we think about Ayn Rand's ideas, we're not thinking about it in the third person as some kind of what so-and-so thought about the truth. We're thinking about reality and how we live our own lives by our understanding of it. That's how I think about it, and that's how a lot of you think about it. And so objectivism is my philosophy, and for those of you to whom this applies, it's your philosophy. But also, it's our philosophy in that we come together as a community over this shared value. And a lot of your relationships with other people in this room are predicated on thinking, this is not just my philosophy, but also his and hers. And I think that's something that we have to understand and notice. And notice in light of all the things I've just been talking about. It's radical, and we have that in common. It's hard to think clearly about this and to be objective about these matters, and maybe we don't always live up to that standard, and we should encourage ourselves and one another too. We all are going to bring certain baggage to it for the reasons that all radicals bring certain baggage to their thinking, and so forth. Let me look at the issue of objectivism being Ayn Rand's philosophy in another way quickly, and then I'll turn to some more advice on how to be objective about it. So, objectivism is the philosophy of Ayn Rand as distinguished from what? Well, the philosophy is to be distinguished from other aspects of Rand's thought or character, for one thing. For example, Rand's personal preferences. She liked cats. She liked smoking. She liked the color blue-green. She liked Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky. She liked adversarial romances and seemingly rough sex. That's not part of objectivism. Those are other things about Ayn Rand. It's also to be distinguished from her theories in fields other than philosophy. If she had views about psychology, for example, views about masculinity and femininity, views about homosexuality, views about, well, any other topic that's not philosophy, but worked out views in a field, that's not part of objectivism, because it's not part of philosophy, and objectivism is a philosophy. Also not objectivism, not part of objectivism, are Rand's judgments about specific people, events, and trends, historical trends and contemporary trends, just what she thought of Lyndon Johnson, or of the hippies, or some narrow smoking pot or something. These are not part of objectivism because they're too narrow. Now, often I find when people make this point, it's with a kind of weird air of relief, or, oh, so we can just throw out that crap. That's not part of objectivism, and we're here about objectivism. But that's not what I'm saying. Ayn Rand's a brilliant thinker. She's a novelist that I really respond to and get a lot out of, and all of this stuff is part of that. When you respond to a novelist, you're responding to a whole worldview. And her views on masculinity and femininity and all kinds of other things are part of those characters, part of that world. Her preferences for skyscrapers and certain kinds of relationships are part of that, even if they're not part of her philosophy. They're part of the influence that many of us have gotten from her and that many of us really value and treasure. So, when I say something's not part of objectivism, that's not like, who cares about that? It's a different thing, perhaps a very good thing, but not part of objectivism. Moreover, I should say, all of these things are related to objectivism. Philosophy is comprehensive in the sense that it applies to all of life. It just doesn't include every little detail because it applies to life on a fundamental level, not by kind of exhaustively going through each thing and opining about it separately. So for you, your philosophy is at work in all of your values, all of your preferences, all of your judgments about specific elections and issues and so forth. It's just those things can't be read off directly from your philosophy. They're applications of it combined with all kinds of personal and idiosyncratic and situational material that are too detailed to fall under the heading of philosophy. And there are a lot of borderline cases where it's not clear. Is this on the cusp of philosophy and psychology? I'm not sure what this is. There are a lot of cases where if you notice somebody applying a philosophical principle wrongly, as you understand it, continually, you are right to start to think, yeah, I know, how to judge George Bush is just one concrete, not philosophy, and how to judge Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are each just one concrete and not philosophy. But I mean, come on, you can't think this about all these people and really understand that statism is bad. That is, if you're enthusiastic and a cheerleader about these guys, or you don't take seriously their evil. All right, we also want to distinguish objectivism from any mere list of theses that Ayn Rand held. Ayn Rand would summarize objectivism in different ways, and we often do. We say it's something like, reason, egoism, and capitalism. Or there's like, standing on one foot version where you get words in a couple of sentences. All of those things are summaries to or introductions or overviews to objectivism. But they're not the philosophy, because no list of propositions can be a philosophy. A philosophy is a system of thought, something that's integrated and works together as a whole and can't be conveyed in list form. You need to convey it in a treatise, a speech. You can convey it at different levels of detail at different lengths, but you have to capture the systematicity of it. Now, if you're looking for a guide to what is objectivism, what's the whole, how does it fit together, there's no better one than Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. It's a spectacular book. It helped a lot of us, certainly me, get a sense of what this whole is. Leonard Peikoff is writing as, a student and interpreter of Rand's. What he says doesn't make it her view or her philosophy, but he knew her very well. He knew the issues very well. He's really smart, and he did a fantastic job. And because there are borderline cases of what's in philosophy and what isn't, there are always going to be things one can quibble about. I wish he'd included that or didn't this. But if you're looking for a starting point to get a sense of what's in and what's out at some length, I recommend the book. Okay. We want to distinguish objectivism from everything Ayn Rand thought or did or held. We want to distinguish it from any kind of mere list of things she thought, because it's a unity, a sum, an integration of views. We need to distinguish it from other people's ideas that may have been inspired by Rand in various ways. Dr. Peikoff's, Harry Binswanger's, Yaron Brooks, my own, whoever it might be. And we want to distinguish it from your own knowledge or beliefs. Now, this is important, particularly in light of the point I made earlier that objectivism is, for many of us, our philosophy or your philosophy. It's your philosophy in the sense that it's the philosophy you live by. But what it is for it to be your philosophy, what it is for it to be true, and what it is for you to think that it's true, is not the same thing as for it to be objectivism, to be this particular philosophy. And I think a lot of confusion comes from not differentiating between these two issues. The same thing might be Harry's belief and my belief, but what it is for it to be Harry's belief about something and what it is for it to be my belief are very different. How we'd tell if it was Harry's belief or it was my belief is very different. And I think a lot of kind of issues that people have had, struggles people have had with objectivism in the objectivist movement have been based on a failure to make this differentiation, or in some cases a willful and dishonest attempt to evade it. If people are familiar with the open system debate in objectivism and David Kelly, that's what I think is going on here. Kelly argues things like, well, of course, your knowledge has to be an open system. It has to be flexible, accommodate new information as it goes in. You can't freeze your knowledge and say, well, what I believe now about everything could never change in light of any new evidence. Your knowledge has to be an open system. And he's right. Your knowledge does have to be an open system. You can't say, come what may, I'll never change my mind about anything. But that doesn't mean that someone else's knowledge, someone who's dead, can be an open system, can be subject to revision. If a certain principle of measurement omission or whatever it is, if you come to change your mind about it because you rightly or wrongly think you have new evidence, that means you've changed your mind about it, and maybe that you should have, or you've added to it or qualified it or supplanted it or replaced it as your knowledge, as your beliefs about the world, not as part of the system of knowledge that somebody else formed, right? And this brings me to the point that there are two questions that we always need to keep distinct in our minds. What is the truth about such and such? And what does so-and-so think about such and such? Questions about understanding reality and understanding someone else's view of reality. These latter questions are questions of interpreting other people. Now, other people are part of reality, of course. So if I'm trying to figure out, what does Carl think about this, I'm thinking about something in reality, namely Carl. But I'm not thinking about the this that he's thinking about. I'm thinking about him. And we have to keep these two separate. And the reason why it's important and sometimes hard to keep it separate is that we often think in conversation with other people. Everyone has to do his own thinking individually. Only you can judge, conclude, evaluate for yourself. But other people help you to do it, and they help you to do it by you talk to them. And when you're in a conversation with someone else as you're thinking about something, it can be difficult to keep track of what are your own conclusions and which are theirs. This happens all the time in just normal, casual conversation. I'm thinking about an issue and I call up a friend. Sometimes I've talked through issues with Ankar or Harry, or just other issues, and at the end of the call, I've come to a clearer understanding of the issue. And that was my purpose in the call, to figure out, what's true about this issue. How ought we to interact with a certain group? Should I accept this invitation to speak for Students for Liberty or whatever it is? And I'll talk to someone about it as I'm thinking about it. I'll get their ideas, we'll bounce it off. And all the while I'll be thinking about the topic, and I'll reach a certain view at the end of it. And the view that I've reached at the end of it incorporates all kinds of ideas and material that I got from the other person, right? That sparked my thinking, that I built off of. But at the end of the call, if you ask me, well, what exactly does Harry or Ankar think, or whoever it was I was talking to, I might not be able to answer. I might not be sure. Because my focus on the call was just figuring out what's true about this issue. When I got an idea from him, I didn't kind of pause and tag it as, oh, well, that was Harry's and so forth, and make sure I had him right. I just ran ahead with thinking about it. And I have to step back and think, I'm not sure if he came out in the same place that I did. Or here's something I got from you, but I'm not sure if that's how you understood it. It just prompted this thought in me. Right? That happens in conversation with people all the time, and it's fine. It wouldn't be fine, though, if you assumed that the result of a call was consensus with someone else when it wasn't. If you went around reporting their views and you didn't have them right. But so long as you know what you're doing, that's okay. Well, we think in conversation with others not only in literal back and forth in real time, but also as we're exploring and studying issues, we read other people. We read Euclid, or probably we don't anymore, but we should, as we're learning and thinking about geometry and trying to figure out what the truths of the shapes are. We read Darwin and Einstein, or anyway, the author of textbooks, as we're doing various science and learning the truth about scientific matters. We read Aristotle and Plato and Ayn Rand and Hume and Kant and Hegel and whomever as we're thinking about philosophical issues. And we think about these issues in that way in conversation with these other people. And because we're doing that, it can sometimes be, it's not automatically clear to us what are our own conclusions and what are these people's. What are our own concepts and which of them are shared with the people I was reading. It's work to think about the issue clearly, the issue of, say, what's the best way to live, and it's also work to think clearly about other people's views on these issues. Now, of course, our goal is to get reality right. Our goal in thinking about philosophy is to know how to live better, to know how to know. So you might think that only the first of these two questions, what is the truth about such and such, is important, and understanding the other person's view isn't that important. But there were two reasons why I think, if I had to pick one, that would be the more important, but there were two reasons why I think that's not, the second question is really important as well. First of all, it's part of reality that certain ideas were held by certain people at certain times. It's part of history. It's part of the world that's useful to know. It's useful for understanding how ideas work, for understanding how the mind grows. So for the reason that history is important, it's important. But moreover, understanding other people's views, understanding the views of the people you're engaged with and thinking in conversation with, understanding that this is what he held and why he held it, is important because it helps you get reality right. The sort of people who we get good ideas from reading or talking to are usually brilliant, if they're very good ideas we're getting for them, and they've usually spent a lot more time thinking about the issues than we have. So there's almost always more to learn from them than the initial flash of insight we get when we quickly read through their text and then are prompted to start thinking in new ways. These people repay further study, and it's worth taking the time to make sure you have them right. There are lots of cases, and you could ask me for examples later if you like, in philosophy, in the special sciences, where a certain kind of charismatic idea held by a brilliant figure, people just ran with it and got ahead of themselves, having misunderstood it, and the science didn't develop as well as it could have. And it's especially easy to confuse these two types of thinking, thinking about what's true and thinking about what other people think is true, when you're building on someone else's ideas. particularly when you're building on concepts you got from them, and particularly when you only kind of understand those concepts. For example, I've heard a lot of conversations about focus, the concept Ayn Rand uses in her theory of free will, or about selfishness or about rights, where it's unclear, I think, to the people involved in the conversations whether they're trying to reconstruct what Ayn Rand's view is, how she came by this concept, what she meant by it, what her evidence for it is, or whether they're just using a word they got from her fresh without kind of thinking, in a way independent of her initial use of it. And I think there's a kind of weird character these conversations have. Once you become alert to this, you start to notice it. And they're not productive discussions. They're not productive thought. So I think you really need to think separately about what is the truth about such and what does so-and-so, Euclid, Einstein, Aristotle, Newton, the guy you're talking to, Ayn Rand, think about whatever subject you're thinking about. And in healthy thinking, these two topics interact. You spiral back and forth from one to the other quite a bit. But nevertheless, they're separate topics. There are separate methods related for doing each of them, separate standards. Again, both instantiations of the wider principles of epistemology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these things separately. How can we determine what's true in philosophy? And how can we be objective in interpreting other people? That is, get to what's true about what those people thought. And I'm not going to say that much about these things, because my main point is that we have to be engaged in these projects separately and tease them apart. But I will say a little about each, and I'm going to point you to good resources on each. So, how can I know a philosophical system to be true? This is a question that I think a lot of us face. A lot of us, either now or in the past, read Atlas Shrugged, or read Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, or read The Virtue of Selfishness, or whatever we read, and we experienced it as a whole new way of looking at the world. Wow, this is a whole new perspective. And whole is important there. It's not like this is different and that's different, but this person's coming from a really different place. And there seems to be something right about it. And it's a radically different place. That means I've got to change my life as a whole and change the world as a whole, or work to do it. And yet, you don't want to be caught up in something you don't understand. You don't want to jump on a bandwagon. So you think, well, let me slow down. How do I know if this whole is true? How do I evaluate a philosophical system? Being objective about philosophy is hard. And objectivism is a philosophical system, a philosophy, not just a couple of particular points, and that adds added challenges. Well, in short, you don't start with the system. You start with specific concepts or theses. Now, it's not bad that you have the idea that there's this whole here, that this person doesn't just have interesting ideas that you want to evaluate on this or that topic, but that there's a whole way of looking at the world that you want to evaluate and think about. That's good. You know where you're going. You know that there's a real project here to think this through, and there's something about the whole, not just the parts, that inspires you. But you can't swallow a whole. Alan Godhelf reports having had a conversation with Ayn Rand about this at one point, where he was a bit flustered about whether something, I won't go into the details, but she said that there was a Hegelian premise at work in thinking that you have to accept or reject objectivism, taking it as a whole. You don't. Objectivism is an integration of many different theses on particular topics. It's an integration of them rather than a list, right? It's not just reason's good, there's a reality, you should be selfish. It's a whole that's made up of them, but it's a whole that's made up of them. And you have to build to that whole separately. So start with specific concepts and theses that interest you and that you have some reason for thinking are true. For each, ask, what reasons do I have for thinking? Or what reasons have I been given for thinking this is true? And doing that is what we talked about before. It's reduction. You're tracing it back to the evidence for it, to things that you don't only kind of know why this idea appeals to you, why you think it's true, but really know. Tracing it back to its evidence in perception, in your own experience. And having done that, you try to connect each of these ideas with other ideas. Well, how does the idea that a lot of people don't seem to really care about what's true relate to the idea that it's wrong to sacrifice? Those are two objectivist ideas. How do they relate to each other? Rand seems to think they do, and I kind of have a sense that they relate to each other. It's not just two separate points, and you start to build up that connection. Now, as you do this, you're normally going to need to entertain each thesis and each connection. You're going to need to hold it in mind and think about it for a long time tentatively as you gather evidence for it. It's not like you start with thesis one, existence exists. That one's maybe a little too basic. But you start with man has free will, and all right, I've reduced it, I've proved it, that's good, I'm done with that. Now let me move on to the next one, and you prove that and you integrate them. Rather, you hold different ones in mind at a time. You work on getting a little bit, well, why does this seem right? How sure can I be of it? How does it relate to the other ones? Over time, because philosophy is something that requires a lot of evidence. And you gather that evidence and you see that theses are true and you see how they relate to your more basic experience in life and how they relate to one another over time. You kind of try them on. You carry this perspective with you as, here's how Rand or Aristotle or Hume or something views such and such an issue. Or anyway, here's one way of viewing such and such an issue that's new and unfamiliar to me, but it seems like there's something right about it. And over the course of days or weeks or months or years, carrying that idea around in your head with you, you start to see, yeah, this makes sense of a lot of the world. This accounts for a lot of evidence that I wasn't otherwise able to explain. This fits well with the other things that I know. And this happens to many theses over time. And eventually, if you're dealing with a true philosophy and you're thinking rationally about it, eventually you come to know each of the ideas to be true, and the ideas form into a whole, into a system that enables you to understand each idea and the world more deeply than anyone does individually. Now, this process continues across a lifetime, and it's possible to perform it at different levels of intensity, in great detail, in more of an overview, in a more scholarly way, in a more layman's way, as philosophy for Reardon versus philosophy for Ragnar, if you know that distinction that Ayn Rand made. But I think there is a certain point along in one's mental life when one's thinking first coheres into a whole explicit worldview about which you know enough to be certain. And you have to think for yourself about when that is. And that's the point at which you would think of yourself as an objectivist. If, that is, the whole explicit worldview that you've come to be certain of is Ayn Rand's. We'll talk about how to know whether the ideas that you have are hers, are objectivism, or Aristotle's or Hume's or anyone else. There's nothing specific to Ayn Rand about any of this talk in a moment. But I just want to give two examples, two places where I think you can get really good insight and examples of this process of philosophical learning by reduction of different premises, of different particular theses, and integration of them into a whole. The one where you get the most explicit discussion of this, the one that was really an eye-opener about it to me, is Dr. Peikoff's lecture series, Objectivism Through Induction. And there he shows how each of several principles of objectivism, separately, shows how each of several principles of objectivism can be induced from reality, from your own experiences of the world. And in doing that, what he's doing is reducing each to the evidence for it. And in addition to showing for several different principles that there's free will, that we need to be objective, that you should be egoistic, that you need to be just and honest, in addition to doing it for each of the principles, reducing it, he also, at the end of each lecture, talks about now how we can integrate that with the previous material covered in the course. And I think you really get a sense of firsthand what it is for a mind to do this work from that course. So I can't recommend it highly enough. I think it's one of the very best lecture series that's been given on this philosophy. And really it's an invaluable aid. The other is a source that I've already recommended in a way, and that's Atlas Shrugged. So what the story that we follow in Atlas Shrugged is the story of Reardon and Dagny becoming convinced of certain philosophical truths, ultimately becoming convinced of a philosophy. I mean, the whole plot of the novel is about what John Galt does, but the part that we follow, that we, as we trace through it, is the effects of what he does on Dagny and Reardon, and that puts them in a position where they have to check certain premises, get new ideas, integrate them successively over time, and come to a whole new worldview. One of the things that I think Atlas illustrates so well is how this process takes time, how it works in detail psychologically, psychoepistemologically, what kind of traits of character are involved in doing it, and what it feels like from the inside. And so I highly recommend Atlas Shrugged for that, as well as for so many other things. Plus, by following through the novel with these characters, by living in this world with them, by tracing their own lines of thinking with them, you're in effect doing the process, or you can do the process with them, on most of the most important aspects of the philosophy. And if you want help in reading and thinking of Atlas Shrugged in this way, I recommend my own essay, Discovering Atlantis, in Robert Mayhew's essays book, Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, where I talk a lot about the different steps in Dagny and Reardon's thinking, when they're connecting different things together, when they're checking different premises. Another thing that Atlas Shrugged is very good on, in addition to giving you a sense of how to do this kind of thinking for yourself, what it's like from the inside, is the perspective to take on other people who are engaged in the process. After all, the book's about John Galt and what he's doing, how he's convincing and persuading people, how his agent Francisco d'Anconia is doing it often in the case of Dagny and Reardon. And it takes a long time for these guys to come around. Some people who I think this is a not very astute way to read the book. She heard Galt's speech. She met John Galt. Why didn't she just go on strike? The whole philosophy was there. What's these dents? But that's not how it is. It takes a long time to entertain these ideas, think about them, live them, experiment with them in your own thinking in life, see if they are right. It takes a long time for brilliant people. It takes a long time for us. So don't go too quickly. And think about your relationships with other people here in that term. Be ambitious, try to get the whole, try to get down to the bottom, try to get full clarity on everything. But be patient with yourself and others. And for time, I'm going to skip some of the details I have about this. But if you guys want, during the question period, you could ask me about wearing a fisherman's cap and why you shouldn't do it, and about how all of this relates to some mistakes people make when dating. I think both of those analogies help to concretize some points about being objective. Let me move, though, to the question of, we've been talking about how you can tell if a philosophy and a philosophical system is true, what kind of thinking is involved. I want to talk now about what's involved in interpreting someone else objectively. Objectivity involves reducing, going back step by step to your evidence, and it involves integrating, taking each individual thing you've learned and trying to connect it to the rest into a larger whole. We've seen how you do that in learning what's true about reality and in learning philosophy in the sense of getting at the philosophical truth. How do you do it in interpreting someone? Here I don't have that much to say, but I want to make a few points. And in a way, these are obvious, but I think just having named them helps us to be clear about what we're doing when in our thinking. Because a lot of the difficulty in being objective is in distinguishing your own mental processes from one another and knowing when you're doing what, when you're thinking versus feeling, and within thinking when you're doing which kind of thinking. So, how can I objectively interpret another thinker? Reduce each interpretive claim to textual evidence. By an interpretive claim, I mean a claim like so-and-so thinks such and such. And by textual evidence, I mean like, here, she said it on page 57 of this book, or it could be in this speech. Now, as with all the other processes I've mentioned, this can be done in greater or lesser detail. You could say, well, here, page 296, paragraph 2, the second sentence is where it says exactly these words. Or you can say, yeah, I remember reading it somewhere in Atlas Shrugged. How much detail you go into, the more the better from a certain perspective, but you only have so much time in a life and you have to prioritize what work you do when. What you need, though, is to be aware that this is what it takes to prove that someone thinks something, to be able to point to where they said it, right? And to know that there are different levels of details at which you can do that. That's reduction, that's interpretive reduction, reducing an interpretive claim to the evidence for it. Find the primary source, where was it said? And you integrate everything you learn about what a thinker thinks with a number of things. First of all, with everything else you've learned about that thinker. And when you integrate one of her thoughts, she thinks this, with another one, she also thinks that, what you're doing is building in your mind her system of thought. Just like when you learn one truth and integrate it with another, you're building in mind a larger and larger picture of reality. When you learn that Ayn Rand thinks, when you learn not just that you should be selfish and you should be honest, when you integrate those, you're learning more and more about ethics and understanding ethics more comprehensively. When you learn about Ayn Rand that she thinks you should be selfish and she thinks you should be honest, and you put those together, you're getting a more and more comprehensive picture of her worldview. And often we'll do these things together because we're thinking about how we should live in conversation with her. And, so it's not like you do one on Tuesday and the next 2 months later, but they are separate mental acts. You integrate everything you learn about her with everything else you've learned, every other thing you've learned she thinks, so that you're building a picture of her whole, as addition to building your own whole system of knowledge about the world. Second, you integrate what you've learned about a thinker with the other things you know about the subject, whether you've learned them from them or not. And that helps you understand a lot about that person's thinking. Is she thinking about it well or badly? Is she well-informed or ill-informed? You also need to integrate it with what you know of other thinkers who are similar in various respects. There are lots of thinkers who are similar to Ayn Rand in different respects, some more important than others. Ayn Rand is, for example, a thinker influenced by Aristotle. In that respect, she's like Thomas Aquinas, Averroes, Rosalind Hursthouse, to pick someone contemporary and of a lesser stature, I think, but good. And you would expect there to be a lot of different commonalities between these thinkers that come from their having this thing in common, and some interesting differences because of the different ways in which Ayn Rand processed Aristotle and these other people did. So every time you notice something, you think, Ayn Rand's an Aristotelian. How does she relate to other Aristotelians? Ayn Rand is a philosopher who's a novelist. How does she relate to other philosophers? What points are in common, which are different? She's someone who really emphasizes reason and its role in life. That's something she has in common with the Enlightenment. So how is she similar and different to other Enlightenment figures? Or rather, to Enlightenment figures, people like Locke. She's a radical. How is she similar and different to other radicals? Abolitionists, Marxists, feminists, some good radicals, some bad. But there are going to be some things in common because of just the radicalness. If you think she's a genius, as I do, how does she relate to other genius philosophers as opposed to more middling ones? Right? In what ways is she like Aristotle? And in what ways different? And so forth. Now, this whole process, the reduction and the integration, can be performed at various levels of intensity. You can get the sense, oh, she's pro-reason. Who else was pro-reason? The Enlightenment people like Locke. Yeah, I see some similarities between them, and that's an integration. They both, for example, were very concerned about the use of words and using words objectively. And that's an integration, and that's good. Or you can do it in much greater detail, studying Locke and saying very subtle and nuanced similarities and differences. As with all intellectual work, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. But you also have to choose how to allot your time in a life, and there's a division of labor. So I'm not saying everybody should become an Ayn Rand scholar, but it's, I think, nice that some of us have. And everyone should be alert to the issue that there's such a thing as studying someone in detail, and there's non-detailed ways of doing the same kind of work. There are questions that we need to answer about what do different people think, what do the people that are influences on us and whom we admire and whom we're thinking in conversation with think. How do we know that they think it? How can we trace it back to our evidence that they think it? And how does the fact that they think it fit with the other things we know about them and about other thinkers and about the world? Now, in my not so humble opinion, the best model of this kind of thinking with respect to Ayn Rand, of interpretive thinking with interpretive reduction and interpretive integration with her, is the book I just edited with Ellen Godhouse, or anyway, that just came out that I edited with Ellen Godhouse, A Companion to Ayn Rand. And this is, I think, a compendium of, I think, the best Ayn Rand scholarship by the best scholars on her, which is distinct from the best work in objectivist philosophy, because our goal in the book was not to get what's true about the world, although I think the book helps you to understand a lot of things about what's true about the world, but to understand her, to ask these interpretive questions. And I've said before why I think that's helpful. why I think that's worth doing, why it's related to thinking about what's true. Let me just say personally, I shuttle back between these two ways of thinking a lot. I do it with Aristotle, with Ayn Rand, with other people I read. But as a matter of my career, there's been a period now for several years where I've been actively focused on this kind of scholarly thinking about her. When I first discovered Ayn Rand, I was just really impressed by these ideas and excited about them and a new way of thinking about the world, and I was mostly focused on understanding the world. And most deeply, that's still what I'm mostly focused on. But when I started working on my essays on Robert Mayhew's books about Ayn Rand's novels, I started realizing, well, now I'm really writing about her in these essays, not writing about the world. And I'm doing the kind of thing I do when I study Aristotle or Plato. And let me try to apply what I've learned from studying them to her. And the companion for me and for the other authors, I think, is the furthest we've gotten in doing that. And let me just say that I was surprised by how much more I learned from her by going back and looking at her that way than I had before, after years of, I think, really having studied objectivism in some depth. And I think the other authors will tell you the same thing and people who read it. So I recommend the book very highly. It's on sale at a great Carl, you told me I should be more promoting myself and marketing more aggressively. So it's on sale at a great discount here. If you're a student, there are opportunities to get it for free, thanks to a generous donation. Okay, so I really recommend that book, both for its, I think, quality, but also as a model of this kind of thinking. Let me close with a little bit of concluding advice with an eye to the movement. First, what I've been saying, always keep separate but related the question of, well, what's the objectivist view of so-and-so and what's true? Second, think of objectivism as an integration of many ideas, not as a monolith, as one single whole to be swallowed whole, nor as a list of discrete ideas. Relate to others who are trying to understand this philosophy, who are thinking about the world in conversation with Ayn Rand and who value her. Relate to them over areas of agreement and shared values. That includes the shared value of learning, of understanding the world. And I think for all of us here, whether we're objectivists or not, it includes the shared value of Ayn Rand and of objectivism. Because we're all here because we find something interesting, valuable, good for us about this philosophy and want to know more about it. So it's a value for us, wherever ultimately we come down on agreeing with the whole or this or that part. Take these values, the shared values over which you interact with people, seriously and insist on respect for them. So if someone says, there's a lot of, particularly when people are distinguishing what's part of objectivism or Aristotelianism or whatever from the other things that thinker held, there's often a kind of contemptuous and snotty jerk tone to it. That's not appropriate. It's an anti-valuing, unjust, anti-integrity thing. If someone's someone you take seriously, admire them, respect them, value them as a person, and insist on that in your dealings with other people. But don't worry at least prematurely about whether you or anyone else is an objectivist. If you're running ARI and you have to hire and fire people or something, at some point that issue might come up. But it's not a primary in your life. It's come up for me sometimes, but it's not. Worry about what they think, what they agree with and disagree with, what you share and don't share with them. And use your engagement with Rand and with one another primarily as an opportunity to learn about the world and to improve your own lives. Advocacy of any sort is a secondary goal to that, and it'll be more successful, I think, in a context that's set by those shared premises and those shared values. So that's what I think about how we can be more Galt-like in our lives and in our community, and in our processing of what Ayn Rand has to teach us. Thank you.
Fisherman's cap in dating mistakes.
Fisherman's cap and dating mistakes. Okay, thanks, Dan. When I was in college, one of my very good friends found himself, and I noticed this about him too, going through a kind of odd cycle. He'd adopt a certain major, and he'd be really into it. For a while, he was going to be an English professor, then he was going to be a TV producer. I forget the order of these things. But when he had that major, he was really into it. He was a member of whatever activities. He read all the books. He's a little bit know-it-all-y on the subject. And he was like, if anyone's going to be a TV director, it's this guy. If anyone's going to be an English professor, it's this guy. And so on for, I think, 2 or 3 different professions. And then at a certain point, he'd go into this kind of period of depression, and he wasn't happy, and he didn't want to do that, and he didn't know what he wanted to do for a while. And then he adopted something else, and it was suddenly he was really gung-ho about the thing. And 2 or 3 times into this, he and I had a conversation. This is someone I was very close, I'm still very close with. We had a conversation, what's going on? It seems like you were so into being an English professor, and now you're so into this, and before, yet none of them stick. What's up? And he was thinking about what's up too, and we talked about it for, an evening. And the way he described it, this is one of these cases where it's hard to remember what he thought and what I thought, but this is the conclusion I came up with out of the conversation. He's like a guy who doesn't really know what he wants to do, doesn't really have a hobby. He's looking for something in his life. Maybe he's after a divorce or something and depressed and not sure what the next stage of his life is going to be. And a friend says, hey, you want to come on a fishing trip with me? And he does. He goes fishing for the afternoon, and he enjoys it. He catches a fish or 2. He really has a good time that day. Such that a natural, reasonable, rational response, a great thing for him to do would be go fishing again, learn a little bit about fishing. But because there's something he needs, because he's really aware of an emptiness in his life, because he's not sure what to do with himself, he goes beyond that. He really throws himself into fishing. He buys every piece of fishing gear and magazine. He books month-long fishing excursions. And then 2 months later, he wakes up in a swamp with knee waders and a fisherman's cap on. And he thinks, who the hell am I? What am I doing here? Now, I think people, especially young people, do that a lot. I knew another guy in high school who seemed like he never knew how to relate to people. And then he watched the movie Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. And for 6 months, he was Jim Carrey, exactly. Now, incidentally, he's become a preacher. But this happens to better people, too. If you're aware that you're missing something, if you're frightened, if you're not sure what to do in this great wide world out there with your whole life, and something looks like a kind of whole, a whole community, a whole way of life, it's very easy to just kind of too quickly substitute it for your own identity, to swallow the thing whole and be that guy, rather than taking it apart and saying, well, what did I really like about fishing? How can I have more of that in my life? Is it by fishing more? Maybe what I really liked was the companionship of the boat. So just be careful about getting ahead of yourself in that way, and that's what I call wearing a fisherman's cap. The dating analogy is similar, but it works on both sides. It works both for the guy who's getting into the new thing and the people who are already into it and finding this new potential person who shares their interest. I've met a few people over the years who go on first dates and treat them like interviews for marriage. So, how many kids do you want? What kind of pets? And it's pretty clear that this guy's got some premise I need to be married by 32, I'm 30, or women do it too, but women are stereotypically do it more, but I've noticed it more in men for whatever reason. And so the whole date is is this the one? That is not a good, rational way to date. Epistemologically speaking, the proposition that this person might be your soulmate is not even at the level of possible epistemologically on the first date. If you want to know more about that, take my course on Objectivist Epistemology and Outline. But anyway, the rational hypothesis to be considering on a first date is, this person's interesting, I should want to get to know them better, maybe we could have some kind of relationship. And then, sometime in, these larger possibilities might emerge. Likewise, with objectivism, it shouldn't be you read, or with Kant or Hegel or any philosophy, it shouldn't be you're reading it is this my whole life now? Is this my worldview? Are you my mommy? Is this my philosophy? Rather, and when somebody else, a kid just read Atlas Shrugged, are you going to be a member of my thing? Are you going to be an objectivist like me? Will you marry me? It's not the way to think about it. You think, what particular things do we have in common, and build up. Now, both with the dating and with the philosophy, let me add a caveat. Sometimes you meet someone, or, I've met people who did immediately feel, maybe I want to marry this person when they met them. But the ones where it worked out, they didn't act on that premise. They said, all right, slow down. It can't really be, it does feel like, but it can't, all right, let's slow down and have a normal couple of dates with the person and not get ahead of myself, though I really have a good feeling about this one. And I think, that's how I felt about objectivism. And I think it's, but you should be self-consciously not getting ahead of yourself, and not getting ahead of yourself in your expectations or desires for other people, or even what you entertain as possibilities about them. If you have an objectivist club, if you're a teacher teaching an Ayn Rand work or an Aristotle work, whatever, you shouldn't be thinking, maybe this guy will agree with me on the most fundamental things and we'll be allies. You should be thinking, maybe he'll learn something from this. Maybe we'll agree on something. And then see what happens. Thanks. Yeah, Ash.
Hi, you talked a little about the importance of understanding principles at the appropriate level of generality.
Uh-huh.
And most of the examples you gave were about applying them in too narrow of a context, but it's also possible to misintegrate and apply them too widely. So it seems like this is a very common mistake that people make.
Well, give me an example of applying it at too high a level of generality.
This might get back to the question you planted about people who just run with an idea before they understand it correctly and misapply it in various ways. So maybe you can touch on that in your answer. But so I'm wondering if you have any advice about how explicitly to identify the appropriate level in a given case. And I noticed you did a really good job of this in your talk, particularly when you were giving advice about how to understand someone else's worldview. So maybe what I'm really asking is, if you can make explicit the principles that you used in organizing this presentation.
So I don't think of it as an issue of not going too general. And I don't think the mistake people make is often or ever going too general. I think the mistake is going general in the wrong way. As you, sort of everything that you observe, me holding this clicker is an example of me, a certain particular concrete individual, engaging in the certain concrete particular action of holding this certain particular concrete other individual, this clicker. It's also an example of existence existing. That's as general as you can get, right? And there are lots of things at intermediate levels of generality to describe what's going on this stage, between existence existing and Greg holding this clicker. The trick is to, not that some descriptions are too general, but to figure out what you can say at each level of generality, and to figure out what universals, what concepts are valid, and which ones are package deals or misintegrations. So I don't really think of it as don't go too general, but make sure that your universal concepts are objective. And there's I don't know what I could say very briefly about how to form objective concepts, other than I've written about this, and Ayn Rand certainly has.
Thanks.
Greg, my question has to do with your identification that objectivists are radicals. And do you have any general principles for at what stage in a discussion with someone who's not an objectivist you let them know just how radical you are? For example, someone asks me, what do you think of this latest welfare reform proposal I just read about in the local paper? These days, after many years of trying to be nice, I am more inclined to say, I don't believe in welfare reform, I believe in welfare abolition. Similarly, government school reform, I'm inclined to tell them right out, well, my basic position is to eliminate government schools. You want to continue talking with me? I'll be glad to.
I'm similar to you in this, but I'd add that I own my radicalism. So I don't just come out with I don't say, I might sometimes just come out with a radical position. I never just come out with a hedgy around the edge position. But what I'll typically say in these kinds of, somebody says, well, what do you think about this particular welfare issue? I'll say, well, I'm a radical. I don't think we should have welfare at all. But given that we have it with respect to this proposition, I think it's a step in the right direction, or it's not, or whatever it is. But I'll say, look, I'm a radical on this. And I think that that helps. That sets the context. And it makes being radical something respectable and it makes it clear. I'm in favor of frankness and candor about things like that. And I think, and making it clear that there's such a type of thing, a radical, that you fall under here, and that you understand that that has certain implications. So that's how I handle it. I know you had your hand up. One more question? Okay. Maggie?
Oh.
I see you're very proud of your own
Yes, I am.
radicalism.
So I was really interested by what you said about the distinction between you were first interested in the ideas and understanding the world and how you could use them for yourself versus studying Rand as you would Aristotle or another philosopher, so a scholarly approach. And I was trying to integrate that myself. What other philosophies today do you think people have that duality where they're not just studied in a scholarly way, but people encounter them and both try to apply them and study them, if you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, we don't have, I was tempted to say unfortunately, but given the quality of them that there have been, it may be fortunately, we don't have many public philosophers. We don't have many philosophers that have a wide public reading, right? So if we're talking about it at the level of philosophy, that's something that abstract and systematic, I can't think of other popular mass audience examples of it now. But I do see it within the philosophy profession. So for example, John Rawls, people know about him. Ayn Rand wrote an article about him. Really took the philosophy scene by storm in the early 70s with this book, A Theory of Justice, and everybody was a Rawlsian, or really deeply influenced by Rawls, and they were building on Rawls. And as Rawls say, as a Rawlsian, I with Rawls think such and such. And it was something like 20 years later that people started thinking, well, slow down, do we have Rawls right? There should be really Rawls studies, and we think about actually the people who see themselves as descendants of Rawls, some of them have departed from him in this way and that. So I think you have it there, and likewise with Wittgenstein. So within the field of philosophy and people professionally studying philosophy, you see it with different philosophers. If you're looking for it in the popular culture, I think you'd look for it on narrower levels than philosophy, but with inspirational figures in different people like Martin Luther King or Gandhi. You can think of them as philosophy, but they're more advocacy or movement driven. You can think of it with leaders of the feminist movement or civil rights movement or certain political movements.
Thank you.
Okay, I think that's it for today. Thanks. Happy 4th, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.